The storm raged over the dark waters of the Atlantic, waves crashing violently against the jagged rocks of Black Hollow Island. In the midst of this fury stood the old lighthouse, a towering relic of a bygone era, its light piercing through the storm like a lone sentinel. For over a century, this lighthouse had guided sailors to safety, yet it was infamous for something far darker. Legend had it that the keeper who once manned this lighthouse had never left. Even in death, he remained, a ghost bound to his duty, his spirit cursed to roam the tower for eternity. Some called it a myth, a sailor's tale meant to spook newcomers, but those who had dared to stay the night in the lighthouse knew better. They spoke of whispers in the wind, footsteps echoing in empty corridors, and the chilling sight of a shadowy figure standing at the top, staring out into the sea as if still searching for something or someone. Ethan Carter was a documentary filmmaker, always chasing the next big story. When he stumbled upon the legend of the Cursed Lighthouse, he knew he had found his next project. The island was abandoned, its history buried under layers of mystery and fear. No one had lived there in decades. The last known keeper had vanished without a trace. In 1924, his disappearance never solved. Some said he had been murdered. Others believed he had simply walked into the sea, consumed by madness. Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan set out with his crew: Mark, a seasoned cameraman; Sarah, a historian fascinated by maritime legends; and Jake, their sound engineer, who had always been skeptical of ghost stories. They arrived at Black Hollow Island just as the sun began to set, the lighthouse looming over them like a silent guardian of the past. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay, and an eerie silence hung over the place. No birds, no insects, just the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocks. Inside, the lighthouse was frozen in time. Dust-covered furniture, rusted tools, and the remains of a logbook left open on a wooden desk. Ethan flipped through the pages, his fingers tracing the final entry. He calls to me. The waves whisper his name. I must go. The ink was smudged, as if written in haste. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind them, making Sarah gasp. Mark chuckled nervously. Nice touch. Hope you got that on camera. But as the night deepened, the playful skepticism faded. The first sign came when their equipment started malfunctioning. Batteries drained in minutes, cameras flickered, and their radio picked up a faint voice speaking in a language none of them understood. Then came the footsteps, soft at first, then louder, pacing the upper floors where no one had ventured yet. Jake, ever the skeptic, went up alone, determined to prove there was nothing there. He never reached the top. Halfway up, he stopped, frozen in place. Guys, his voice trembled. There's someone here. Ethan and Sarah rushed to him, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. At the top of the stairs, a figure stood. A tall, gaunt man in an old lighthouse keeper's uniform, his face hidden in shadow. But it wasn't just the sight of him that sent ice through their veins. It was his eyes, or rather, the absence of them. Empty sockets stared back at them, dark as the abyss beyond the cliffs. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked through the closed door leading to the balcony. They ran after him, flinging the door open, only to find nothing, just the cold wind and the endless ocean stretching into the night. But the worst was yet to come. The moment they stepped back inside, the temperature dropped. The walls trembled. The light at the top of the lighthouse flared to life on its own, its beams sweeping across the sea. And then, from somewhere deep within the tower, came a voice, low, sorrowful, and undeniably human. Help me. Would they uncover the truth behind the keeper's fate? Or had they just awakened something that had been waiting for them? The air inside the lighthouse grew impossibly heavy, pressing against Ethan's chest like an unseen weight. The voice had been real, too real. He exchanged a glance with Sarah, who was gripping her notepad so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Mark adjusted the camera, his hands shaking, while Jake, the ever-skeptical sound engineer, stood frozen at the base of the stairs. "We should leave," Jake muttered, but Ethan shook his head. He had come too far to turn back now. Whatever haunted this place, whatever had whispered that plea for help, was calling to them. And Ethan needed answers. They decided to split up, something that, in hindsight, would prove to be their biggest mistake. Ethan and Sarah headed for the lighthouse keeper's quarters, while Mark and Jake investigated the top floor where the ghostly figure had vanished. The quarters were eerily preserved, as if their owner had merely stepped out for a moment and never returned. A small wooden bed stood against the wall, the sheets yellowed with age. A pair of boots remained neatly placed beside it, untouched by time. But what caught Sarah's attention was the journal resting on a nightstand, its leather cover cracked and worn. She flipped it open, scanning the entries. The handwriting started neat, structured, but as she turned the pages, it grew erratic, frantic. "The sea calls to me. I hear his voice in the waves. I saw him again tonight. He stands at the edge of the cliffs, waiting. The light must never go out. If it does, he will come for me." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Ethan, this isn't just a ghost story. The keeper, he was terrified of something in the water." Ethan took the journal, flipping through the pages until he found the final entry. It was dated the very night the keeper had disappeared. "I see him now. He is watching. If the light fails, I will be lost." The ink trailed off, the words smudged as if written in a panic. And then the room grew colder. A sudden sharp noise rang through the lighthouse, metal scraping against metal, followed by a deep guttural moan from somewhere above. Mark and Jake. Ethan bolted up the stairs, Sarah close behind. The top floor was chaos. Mark's camera was on the ground, its lens cracked. Jake stood by the massive glass window, staring at something outside. His face was pale, drained of color. "The light," he whispered. It stopped moving." Ethan followed his gaze. The beam, which should have been sweeping across the ocean, was frozen, locked in place, shining on a single spot in the water. And then, the sea itself began to churn. The waves below crashed wildly, as if something massive was rising beneath them. A shape emerged from the black waters, barely visible. A tall, hunched figure, its silhouette distorted by the mist. But the eyes, two glowing orbs, pierced through the darkness, locking onto the lighthouse. The tower trembled. The walls groaned under an unseen force, and then a deafening voice echoed through the night. "You let the light die." The sound was inhuman, reverberating through their bones. Jake stumbled back, his hands over his ears. Mark scrambled for his camera, but the moment he lifted it, the glass window shattered, sending shards flying across the room. The wind howled through the opening, carrying whispers, frantic, pleading voices overlapping each other. Sarah clutched Ethan's arm. "Or did we wake up?" And then the door behind them slammed shut. The same voice, deep, mournful, whispered from the darkness. "Help me, before he takes me too." Who was he? And more importantly, had they just become part of the curse? Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears as the whispers wrapped around them like a living presence. The shattered window let in a frigid wind that carried something else, a scent of salt and decay, as if the sea itself had begun to rot. Sarah gripped his arm tighter, her breath uneven. Mark fumbled to get his camera working again, his fingers shaking. Jake was the only one who didn't move. He stood frozen, eyes fixed on the unmoving lighthouse beam, the glow still locked onto that single restless spot in the water. "It's watching us," he murmured. Ethan followed his gaze. The shape in the ocean had risen higher, its massive form barely visible beneath the churning waves. The glowing eyes burned through the mist, locked onto the lighthouse. But then something else moved. Something within the room. The air grew impossibly cold. The sound of footsteps echoed from behind them, slow and deliberate. Ethan turned. The lighthouse keeper stood in the doorway. His uniform, soaked and tattered, clung to his skeletal frame. His face, gaunt and hollow, was twisted in agony, but it was his eyes, those empty sockets, that made Ethan's stomach drop. They weren't empty anymore. They glowed with the same haunting light as the figure in the water. The keeper lifted a trembling hand, his fingers curling as if grasping at something unseen. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice rasping like wind through a broken window. "It must stay lit. If it goes out, he will take another." Ethan's throat tightened. Who is he?" The keeper's head twitched, as if straining against some invisible force. "The Watcher," he choked out. "He waits in the deep. He takes those the sea does not claim." His voice grew weaker, barely audible over the crashing waves. "He tried to take me, but I refused. I stayed. I kept the light burning. But now..." The wind roared, and the tower trembled. The keeper's body convulsed. His eyes flared brighter, and then, with a strangled gasp, his form began to fade. "The light. Keep it burning, or he will take you next." The room exploded into chaos. The lighthouse shuddered violently, knocking Sarah to her knees. Mark cursed, trying to shield his camera as the wind whipped through the broken window. Jake, still staring blankly at the sea, suddenly let out a strangled gasp. He staggered backward, clutching his head. No, I hear him. His voice cracked with raw terror. "He's calling my name. He's..." Then, before anyone could react, he turned and bolted for the stairs. "Jake!" Ethan lunged after him, but the floor lurched beneath his feet. The entire structure felt as if it were being pulled, like the sea itself was trying to claim it. The light above flickered violently, casting jagged shadows against the walls. The whispers grew louder, more voices, some pleading, some sobbing, and then one final scream, Jake's scream, cut through the storm. By the time they reached the bottom of the stairs, the lighthouse door hung open, slamming wildly in the wind, and Jake was gone. Sarah let out a broken sob. Mark stood in stunned silence, his camera forgotten. Ethan rushed to the door, scanning the dark shoreline. He barely caught a glimpse, just a fleeting shadow near the edge of the cliff. A figure, walking into the sea. "Jake!" Ethan ran forward. But the moment his foot hit the wet rocks, a massive wave crashed against the shore, sending him sprawling back. When he scrambled to his feet, Jake was nowhere to be seen. Only the water remained, rising, boiling with unseen movement. And then, slowly, those glowing eyes sank beneath the surface, disappearing into the abyss. A horrible silence fell over the island. Ethan staggered back, his breath ragged. The lighthouse still shook, the light flickering in and out. And then, deep within the tower, the keeper's voice returned. softer now, resigned. It is done. Another has been taken, but the curse remains. Sarah pressed a hand over her mouth, shaking. "We need to leave," she whispered. "Right now." Ethan didn't argue. They grabbed what little equipment they could and fled the lighthouse, barely stopping until they reached their boat. As they pulled away from Black Hollow Island, Ethan looked back one last time. The lighthouse stood tall, its ancient walls battered by the storm. But the light? It had started moving again, sweeping across the sea like a watchful eye. It was as if the tower had been satisfied. For now. But Ethan knew the truth. The curse hadn't ended. It had only begun again.